Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. I think the most fascinating conversation to have with this Florida State team going into 2025 is one, figuring out, look, is Mike Norvell the guy in Tallahassee? What do we need to see from Mike Norvell in the 2025 season to give us confidence that he's the right guy to get this thing going back in the right direction? And it kind of goes into a conversation that we've had a lot in this offseason regarding Florida State, and that is there are some fundamental problems within this Florida State program, and they've really been present throughout Mike Norvell's tenure. Now, these fundamental problems were kind of covered up with some really nice transfer portal additions that allowed Florida State to have some really nice success, but purely talent acquisition, player development, those have been problems since Mike Norvell has stepped foot on campus at Florida State. I mean, Dill, we don't need to beat a dead horse here, but I mean, Florida State's recruited a top 15 class one time during Mike Norvell's tenure. He's going into year 6. That's unacceptable. You look at the amount of players that Mike Norvell has gotten to commit to Florida State out of high school, have spent 3 to 4 years with this program and gone to the NFL draft. That number you can count on one hand. Like, they've sent out a lot of NFL draft picks, but a lot of these guys were transfer portal additions. And I want to give Mike Norvell credit for some really nice transfer portal evaluations, doing a nice job with some of the transfer portal additions that you did get. If you want to compete for ACC championships, if you want to compete for national championships, recruiting the high school ranks and developing those players is still king. And that hasn't happened at Florida State. What do they need to show in 2025 to show that those problems are going in the right direction, are on their way to get fixed? That's the conversation I want to get into. Now, before we do, and as always, the Florida State fans, the whole reason we're doing this episode is to kind of gauge how the Florida State fans are feeling about this football team going into 2025. How many wins do you think Mike Norvell needs to have? What does it need to look like? Please let it fly in the comment section. Look forward to hearing from you guys. Dill, without further ado, I will give you the T-box here. Florida State 2025. Let's just start with the win total. And Dill, I would agree, because we had this conversation before we went on a little bit, kind of like, just talking about some of our takes. We both agree that it needs to look a certain way, and that the look of this Florida State team probably matters just as much as how many wins they get. But this ain't Wake Forest. And I say that because I'm a Wake Forest alum, so I'm allowed to say it about Wake Forest. Like, you're at Florida State, you're going to get evaluated on winning football games. How many wins do you think this Florida State team needs to have in 2025 to show you that the thing's going back in the right direction?
I think 6. If they get to 6 wins and some of the things off the field look right, and when I say that, I mean, like, this summer is a big recruiting summer for Florida State. If their recruiting's moving in the right direction, if you see some of the young guys, especially some of those guys who are second-year players, which was probably the best class Mike Norvell's ever brought in, if you see some of them play really good football, I think, to me, the win total doesn't matter that much. If you don't hit that kind of 6 bogey, if you will, that means you lost maybe 1 or 2 games to Stanford or Wake Forest. That's probably a problem. And then it's like, okay, I know this isn't a wildly talented Florida State roster, but it's talented enough to beat those teams and maybe get one against a Pitt or Virginia Tech. But I'm okay with some losses, frankly, if things look the right way, because I just don't see this as a year that you're going to hang in the history books and be like, oh yeah, this was a great one. I think we
totally agree with that. I'm certainly not expecting like a 10-2 national championship caliber year for Florida State. I don't even think the most optimistic Florida State fan is expecting that from this football team, right? But I will say this. I think you have a more talented football team than 8 out of the 12 teams you play. I think Alabama's probably more talented than you. I think Miami's probably more talented. I think Clemson is, and I think Florida is. Outside of those 4 teams, still, I think Florida State's more talented than the other 8 games on the schedule. I'm not saying they have to win 8 football games, because you have a lot of moving parts. You have a new coaching staff. You have new players. You got to get to 7. I think you got 6 layups on this schedule. Like, look, if you're losing to any of these teams highlighted in green, chances are the things we want to see from this program aren't taking place, and Mike Norvell is probably out after 2025. You got to win your 6 layups, and I want them to win at least one, if not both, against Pitt and Virginia Tech. They're both in Tallahassee. Get those ones done. Go 8-4. Show me that players are getting better on this roster. And Dill, maybe my optimism around Mike Norvell changes. But as we sit right now, it's got to be 7 to 8 wins. And like you said, it needs to look right as well for me to want to give Mike Norvell out 2026
Because
season.
honestly, if the recruiting rankings, if they're sitting well outside the top 20 again,
I agree.
you're heading into like the end of the year.
Yeah.
If they even hit that 7 or 8 win total, I don't know if you give him any more time because now I mean, they
Yep.
gave him a budget to get really good assistant coaches right now.
Yep.
You bring in a sitting head coach in Gus Malzahn, you bring in one of the premier DCs and Tony White. He's kind of got the resources. They've been giving him the resources, I would probably say, to
Agreed.
be more successful than he has been. If they can't recruit, then yeah, even if some of the other things look better, because that's fundamentally what's been holding them back from being consistent. Because you can
Yeah.
have a good flash in the pan year hitting in the portal like they did in
Yep.
2023. You
Agreed.
just you can't have the consistency that I think Florida State fans should expect at this
And
point.
they'll want to know what's the frustrating part about the recruiting trail. And I'm sure the sicko Florida State fans listening to this know this. It sounds like it's an effort thing from the staff, like at least with the previous staff. Like it sounded like they just weren't trying as hard as the teams like Georgia, as the teams like Miami, or as the teams like Florida. And that's a problem. Like if you don't have a coaching staff that wants to get out there and be dogs on the recruiting trail, you ain't gonna win at Florida State, because that's where it starts. When you're at a program like Florida State, when the expectations are ACC championships and national championships, you have to have the prerequisite talent to get yourself in that conversation. And I would argue right now, Florida State has not been doing that. And then you couple that with a weak coaching staff that's not developing players the right way. That's how you get a 2-win season.
And that's the second part, because I think the development of this second year class is going to be a big one in terms of just being able to sell recruiting, because I think it's been hard to sell recruitment for the reason you've said is you just look, their recruits aren't going to the NFL. And that hasn't been the case under Mike Norvell's tenure. Again, this redshirt freshman, true sophomore class has the talent to send multiple guys to the league. I think you need to see that from a Charles Lester and Amari Williams. Those type of players need to play that way. And same, frankly, for some guys like, I think of a Daniel Lyons. I'd like to see them put him into the league. I'd like to see them maybe give Omar Graham.
How about this? Daryl Jackson should be a first-round NFL draft pick. Like if we're doing anything, I mean, that he's about as physically gifted as it gets on the defensive line. Here's the rundown of what I'm looking for. And I think it starts with Gus Malzahn as the offensive coordinator. Like you bring in a quarterback in Tommy Castellanos. Look, is he going to be a top 10 NFL draft? Is he even going to get selected in the NFL draft? No, probably not, right? But you brought him in for a reason. He has shown himself to be a quarterback that when he's put in the right offense with the right situation, with the right play caller, he can be a very, very dynamic college football quarterback. I need this coaching staff, headlined by Mike Norvell and Gus Malzahn, to show me that, hey, we handpicked Thomas Castellanos out of the portal. They didn't go after any other guys. We handpicked this kid to come in and run the offense the way we want it to be run. I need you to show me that you can do it. Because I look at this team and Dill, even to the offensive line with Herb Hand.
Enough talent.
This offensive line, the question is, all right, can it come together? The talent ain't a question. Like last year, did you have good enough football players was probably a serious question. This year, I mean, you have a 3 going on 4-year starter. You have a 3-year starter in the SEC in Gunnar Hansen, 3-year starter in the SEC with Micah Pettis. You have probably the best center in the ACC in Luke Petitbaum. You're bringing Adrian Medley. Richard Leonard has played a ton of football in the SEC. I look at this unit and say, all right, I need Herb Hand, the new offensive line coach, to show me that he can get the best out of this unit. I look at this unit and I know it's crazy to say. On paper, like there's not a ton of ACC programs that I'm taking their offensive line over. Like probably not Miami, probably not Clemson, but there are a couple programs that, I mean, I think Florida State has the chance to have one of the better offensive lines.
That's where like, can Mike Norvell will evaluate coaches at a high level is going to be a big one. Because look, you probably say a similar thing about their wide receiver room.
Yep.
It's kind of loaded with
100%.
Again, not a ton of proven. Like Squirrel White's played pretty good. Deuce Robinson's had some good moments. But you look at some of the young guys, Elijah Moore, McCoy, Javen Boggs. you have some really interesting young talent in this room. And that's another, you talk about just pathetically developed
Yeah.
in Mike Norvell's career. Like they've hit on some transfer kids, but the kids that they've kind of brought through their program, not particularly effective at that spot. That's going to be that offensive line, that wide receiver room, the
Yeah.
linebacker room, those rooms where they brought in big time coaches. They got to make something happen.
And Dill, this is kind of what I mean though, as we pull up this depth chart, is like I don't think there's many ACC teams that have this kind of talent, right? You look at this running back room, you got multiple blue chip kids: Gavin Sawchuk, Usman, Cam Davis. You look at this wide receiver room, 4 and 5-star guys. Look at the offensive line, like blue chip guys out of the portal, guys that have shown you they're good football players. You scroll to the defense, it's a very similar conversation. I look at the talent and say, Dill, there are only 4 teams on this roster here. There are only 4 teams on this roster that got better team. And so I need, that's why I'm saying it can't just be 6 to me. Because if it's only 6, that tells me that you're not getting the best out of this roster. And that's really the overarching problem we have about Mike Norvell in Florida State.
See, but part of me kind of thinks that there could be some real even game-to-game variance, because I think, again, when you're that aggressive in the portal and you don't have that much depth, and like I look, there's some positions that they get injuries at.
Yes.
There's going to be some real problems. So I look, okay, maybe you drop games that like, oh, you had a guy sitting out for a game that you just couldn't have. Like Gunnar Hansen can't get hurt, I don't think.
So
that's a real problem.
And here's what I'll say about that is that's another thing I'm looking for. Sorry, chances are you're probably not going to make it through 12 plus games with your same starting 5 offensive line. Lucas Simmons been in this program for, I think he's going into year 3. He should be ready to give you some solid spot starts. Jonathan Daniels going into year 2. Manassi Atiti going in. I look at some of these guys who I liked coming out of high school and say, we're at the point where, hey, I don't necessarily need them to be all ACC guys going into year 2, year 3. But I need them to have the ability to say, hey, we need you to give us the start against Virginia Tech. I need you to come in and not be a liability. And that's Florida State didn't have that last year. That's also what I'm looking for.
But I'm not sure that's been fixed, because I'm not sure that is fixable in 1 year, given the problems Florida State has put into themselves. So that to me is kind of why I don't know. Like you look important, like in the importance of depth is just something a lot of teams are wrestling with and struggling with to an extent. Florida State shouldn't have those problems. They do have those problems because they don't recruit the high school trail well. That's why I don't think the win total matters as much, I guess.
Yeah.
You can't be pathetic. You can't be a 4-win team or a 3 or 2 or 4.
Does it also, sorry to interrupt you, does it also kind of feel like those games that are highlighted in red? Okay, I'm not expecting Florida State to win any of those football games right now. But like, can we go out and show that we're not that far away, or we're closing the gap? We're back on our way to closing the gap between some of these programs.
And you probably don't want to see the same level of quit that you saw last year, because the level of quit was like really disappointing, where you just felt like they just gave up on Mike.
And that was the frustrating part, is like, look, we had question marks about Mike Norvell. It wasn't like it surprised us that the high school recruiting was a problem in 2024. It's something that we've quietly talked about, but it was like hard to jump down Mike Norvell's throat because he just came off a 13-win season. That didn't necessarily surprise us. What surprised me was this team. And if there's one thing I felt like I knew about Mike Norvell, was culture. Like, this team wasn't going to quit. Even if they only won 5 games, they're going to play hard. That didn't happen. If that happens again in 2025, I don't see how you're going to find the way to move on, in my opinion, because then you run the risk of leading this Florida State program to a place where it's going to be very hard to crawl back out of, and it's going to take some time. And so this is a big year. And look, if it doesn't go well, and if you see the same problems that you saw in the 2024 year, you got to figure out a way to move on and go grab someone else, because the longer you let it kind of slide, the harder it gets to get back to where you belong as a program. We'll close it there. I'm fired up to hear what the Florida State fans have to say. Those are kind of the boys' takes on the situation. Appreciate y'all rocking with it. If you guys do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.